So hi, I am Zina. I'm here from Climate Action Leicester and Leicestershire. And I'm here to talk about the changes that we need to see in the city in order to tackle climate change and how they relate to the draft local plan, which the council will be bringing out for consultation tomorrow. The consultation will run from tomorrow until the 7th of December. So we've got 12 weeks. And as I imagine you might know, in February of last year, Leicester City Council declared a climate emergency. And since then, they have conducted a kind of cross between a conversation and a consultation on the climate, which was last year. And a lot of people across the city made a lot of effort to get people to respond to that. And as yet, we haven't seen what comes out of that. And they have also been working on a local plan. So the thing about declaring an emergency is that, in theory, you then treat it as an emergency. And I think the COVID pandemic has really shown what you can do if you treat something as an emergency. But the COVID pandemic has also shown us the possibilities and the problems that come with it, because it shows us what people and governments can do and how fast patterns can change and how fast action can be taken and how we can change our habits. But I think the pandemic has also really highlighted who the people are who suffer most when something like this happens, when there is an emergency. And this will definitely also apply to the climate emergency, because it's the people with the fewest resources and the people who already have the hardest lives who will then be most impacted by situations like this. They are the people who struggle to get by, to pay their rent, to buy their food, who lose their jobs, and who are already struggling. And then here's an extra thing that makes life that much harder. And I think the COVID pandemic has also, to a little extent, shown the extent to which food shortages can occur in different places when something happens that affects large parts of the world at the same time, which obviously is going to be true of climate change. And it has shown us how people can pull together and support each other. So while I talk about climate change tonight, I'm going to be talking about two aspects: reducing the carbon footprint of the city and also reducing the impact that climate change has on the population of the city, especially the most vulnerable people, but everybody. So I've been campaigning on climate issues for about 30 years now, although longer than that to a certain extent. And it seems to me we're at a tipping point at the moment. Things have really changed in the last year and a half. There's been a definite shift of awareness towards climate change. There have been organisations like Climate Strike and Extinction Rebellion. You really see more people talking about climate change, and there's a shift towards action. There are more people actually wanting to do something about it. So there's this kind of determination coming into existence. But I think climate change has also become much more tangible for people, because we've seen those appalling forest fires in Australia, we've seen dreadful flooding across the world, we've seen massive storms devastating the Caribbean, and we've seen flooding right here in the UK, and we've actually experienced heat waves that have impacted us in Leicester. So even in Leicester, we are actually starting to feel the impacts of climate change. And I think that also shifts people towards taking it more seriously. And of course, the International Panel for Climate Change have given us a defined deadline. You have to tackle climate change in the next 10 years, really. And at this moment, along comes the Leicester Local Plan, which is a plan for the next 16 years. So it covers exactly the timeframe in which we need to tackle climate change. And it's about how the city develops in terms of planning. And, you know, we used to have a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of us still struggle with inertia and despair and feeling numb and being terrified and trying not to think about it. But I think that shift towards actually trying to do something feels much more present now than it did 2 years ago. So it feels like this is a moment for a real possibility of change. And the consultation on the local plan feels like a really good opportunity to start to make that shift within Leicester. So what is the local plan? It is a document that national government then agrees, which will define how we develop in the city for the next 16 years. It defines where we agree to have building development. It defines how energy efficient that building development is. It has the potential to define how much renewable energy we generate, although it isn't doing much in that at the moment. It has the potential to shift the ways that we travel to a certain extent, because obviously if you build little independent villages out around the countryside, instead of tying them closely to the city, you leave people very car dependent. So the patterns of development that are in this plan will affect the way that people travel and the decisions that people make around travel. They will also affect it. As a plan, it's designed to show the government that we are going to provide enough housing and to support economic development in the city. Leicester's local plan is especially important because it's going to impact on how other cities develop. A lot of cities look to Leicester to lead the way on this kind of stuff. We are regarded as a particularly green city. We have a history of being a green city. We do well on world levels in terms of how we tackle climate change, which personally I find a bit upsetting, given I don't feel we're doing terribly well. But it does mean that other cities look to us. We will also be one of the first cities in the UK to produce a new local plan since all of the set of climate emergencies across the country were declared. And for that reason alone, other cities are going to look at what we do. So if we make a mess of this local plan, we will not only be messing up the local development for this city, there's every chance we will be encouraging other cities to do the same thing. And that makes it especially important that we push for policy in this plan that will actually tackle climate change. So that's essentially why I want to talk about the local plan in relation to climate change today. So backtracking just for a minute, climate action came into existence at the end of September last year, and a lot of people, over 80 people, came to the launch meeting at a time when we didn't have to socially distance. And we set up working groups, and the working groups included a group that was working on tree planting and a group that was working on housing and planning issues. So, and also a group that was working on events, an events organising group. So this meeting essentially comes to you very much from the planning group, the housing and planning group, but also from the events group. Like, it's a combination of work from those two groups. And we decided to build a climate coalition, which now has over 15 organisations part of it, including Global Justice and South Highfields Neighbours, including the Progressive Jewish Synagogues Green Group, including some Christian green groups, including Extinction Rebellion, Friends of the Earth, CND. So a lot of different groups have joined our coalition. We have not done well at bringing in communities that represent the ethnic diversity of this city, and it's something we really need to work on. And it's been noticeable that one of the working groups that set up was focused on that, but it hasn't done much since the COVID lockdown because it was very dependent on face-to-face meeting. So the City Council launched that climate conversation in last year, and then they produced a draft local plan, and they were going to launch the consultation that's actually going to be launched tomorrow. They were going to launch it in February. So in February, they brought out the plan, they showed it to the councillors, and they had a full council meeting. And we read the plan, and luckily we also downloaded the plan, because they then took it off the website when they decided not to launch the consultation after all. But we have a copy because we read it and we downloaded it. And we read it, and it really doesn't have the policy that we need to tackle climate change in it. So as Climate Action, we wrote to every single councillor saying, this really isn't good enough. It doesn't have the policy that we need to tackle climate change. And we asked people within Climate Action to write to their councillors and to say the same thing, and a lot of people did. And we packed the public gallery at the full council meeting when they were discussing launching this draft of the local plan. And it was really interesting. So in the space of 1 week, the council essentially did a U-turn. Now, I've been attending council scrutiny meetings on both housing for the last year. I've been going to the housing scrutiny meetings for the last year. And for the last 2 years, I've been going to the economic development, transport and tourism scrutiny meetings, just because it gives me a sense of what the council is doing. And up until the full council meeting in February this year, the council was being extremely clear that what they were doing was this was the last draft of the local plan. And they were going to do this final consultation, and then they were going to take it to the government, and they were hoping that they would have it in place with because basically once they take it to national government then have to do an examination, a public inquiry essentially into the plan. But they were hoping for that to happen at the end of this year. So this was going to be the last draft. And like I say, our letter and our campaign at that point was, this really doesn't have the stuff in it that's needed. At that meeting, they said, no, of course this is not the last draft. This is just the next draft. And we will factor in the responses from the climate conversation to this draft. And then we will do another draft before we take it to national government. And I find that very encouraging, because it basically means that the work that we were doing actually shifted. They were actually to us. So I think it's really responding to this consultation. It's easy to feel like the council doesn't listen to consultations, but in this particular case, I hope that they will do that. Can you hear me? Can you just put your thumbs in the air if you can hear me? Because I've just been told my internet connection is unstable. Oh, good. Okay, that's encouraging. So we are in a position where we are asking for 400 people. We're aiming to get 400 people to respond to the local plan. And the reason that we're asking for 400 people, the reason that's our target is because, let me find, here I am, this is where I want to be, is because the last time the council did a local plan consultation on this local plan, they had about 200, 300 responses, personal responses. And we feel if we can get an equal number or a greater number than are likely to respond to this plan, saying what needs to be said about the climate, if the majority of responses that they get talk about the climate, they are much more likely to listen to us. And that is why we have set a target of 400 personal responses to this local plan consultation. And the main point that a council plan response would need to make if you wanted to push for this would be, this plan as it currently stands does not contain specific detailed policy requirement on climate change. It contains policy mentioning climate change, but it is not requirements and it is not specific. And it needs to have requirements. That is the main. So basically, if you know someone who you can talk into writing a response, and if they only have 5 minutes to write that response in, then hold their hand and get them to write a response in their own words that says, specific, detailed policy requirements on climate change are necessary in this local plan. And they can just do that. But if we do it as an online petition, the council will treat it as a petition, and it doesn't get anything like the same weight as if someone writes it in their own words. And ideally that person would send it to their councillor as well, but that's not necessary. They can just send it to the council. So that is the basic thing that we are aiming for. So what I want to do now is to basically summarise what is in the local plan. The local plan sets out 63 sites for development, of which 49 are greenfield sites, and of which 14 are brownfield sites. So 14 of those sites have been developed before, and 49 of those sites are currently undeveloped, and that ranges from the Western Parks golf course to school playing fields to small allotment sites. You know, it's a range of greenfield sites that would, and also to some areas, big areas outside the city boundaries, which they are proposing to develop as part of this local plan for housing. The council have to show the government that they are allocating enough housing to build for the housing need. The government defines what the housing need is. The council have used the equations that the government says they have to use. This is how much housing they have to provide. This plan has to allocate enough land to develop that housing. Otherwise, the government can just say, no, we don't like your local plan. It's not good enough. It doesn't do what it needs to do. We'll write it for you. And to be honest, I don't want national government, who we currently have, writing our local plan. Things can only get worse if that happens. So let's go with our current council, who can surely make a better job of it because they understand the local conditions and they actually care about the climate. They have declared a climate emergency. They may not be doing a particularly good job of acting on it, but they do, I suspect, care. So at the moment, there's nothing in the local plan requiring the brownfield sites to be built on before the greenfield sites. There is stuff in the plan saying that developers should minimise energy use and carbon footprint, but there's nothing specific about what levels they should reach. There is detailed design principles for developers in the plan, but they conspicuously don't have detailed design principles around climate change in the same chapter as where the design principles are. They've put them in a separate chapter called climate change, and they're not requirements, they are suggestions. We'd like you to think about the fabric of the building, that means energy efficiency and insulation, before you think about renewable energy generation. That's a good policy, but it's not a requirement, and it's not in the place where it needs to be. So they have the design principles for developers don't mention energy efficiency, they don't mention renewable energy, because those have kind of been siphoned off into another chapter, and where they are in the other chapter, they're not in as requirements, they're in as, we'd like you to think about this. And no developer thinks about this unless they're required to. They simply don't. In the same way as they don't build affordable housing unless you require them to, they also don't build energy efficient housing unless you require them to. The plan currently requires major developments to demonstrate how the buildings are designed not to overheat or to overcool, but it doesn't set specific standards about that. It requires car parking in every part of the plan, even though we know that extra car parking encourages car use. And there's nothing in the plan about designing development which will discourage car parking. There is stuff in the plan about designing your development to encourage walking and cycling, but there is nothing about discouraging car use. And we know that you actually have to do those two things together. You have to discourage car use at the same time as encouraging active transport and public transport, because otherwise you don't actually get the shift. The plan has all these little outlying, well, these big outlying housing developments on the edge of the city, which, to be honest, don't look very closely attached. And they're quite, I guess the word would be sprawling. They are low housing density. So if you look at somewhere like Ashton Green at the moment, Ashton Green is an example of the kind of thing they're proposing in the local plan. It is semi-detached and detached houses. It currently doesn't have any public transport. It currently doesn't have a good cycle route. The people who live there routinely say, I would like to take the bus, but I cannot. That is the kind of thing that there is more of in this local plan. So, what are we calling for as climate action? We've basically got an 11-point plan, 11 things that we would like to see in this plan. We would like to see the council put in a mechanism in this plan which ensures that before the greenfield sites are built on, before we start building on our playing fields and our allotments and our natural spaces, that we build on the brownfield sites first. We want them to build with, if I wave my mouse around, can you see me waving my mouse? Is that visible from where you are? Okay. Where they do build on green spaces, the council owns a lot of the green spaces that are planned to be built on. And what that means is that they can put building requirements in that they couldn't just impose on developers if they didn't own the land. Because they own the land, they can put in much higher requirements than national standards. So where they're allowing the building on green spaces, we think that they should require those buildings to be deeply energy efficient and to include a maximisation of solar generation of electricity. And they should be designed to discourage car use, and they should be designed to encourage things that enhance community connection, shared use of space, shared possession, shared objects, making sure there is common space as well as private space. We're not saying people shouldn't have private outside space, but we are saying that people should have access to shared space within their community that will enhance social well-being, because when emergencies come along, as climate change comes along, our links to our local community are going to become more and more important for us to survive, to have deep mental health, to be able to survive physically. You know, when there's a storm and half your windows get smashed, you want your neighbours to come and help. You don't want to not know your neighbours. So yes, we want housing that is built on green space to be required to be deeply energy efficient. We also want, where they build on a green space, for them to say half of this green space must not be built on. Instead, it must be enhanced to improve its capacity to cope with climate change. So a lot of the green spaces are currently essentially green deserts. They're just green grass areas, like the school playing fields, for example. They might not be in use. It might be reasonable that the school, they don't have public access. So instead of building on the whole space, you build higher housing density on half of the space, and the other half of the space, you plant it with trees, you give it ponds, you give it good public access. And that will mean that it is able to absorb some of the carbon footprint that comes from the development. It will help to reduce the temperatures during heat waves. It will help to reduce flooding during rainstorms. It will improve people's mental health because they will have access to green spaces, which they currently don't have access to. So if I give an example, one of the sites that's up for development is the playing fields of a school on my road. And the school is quite small. It does not use all of those playing fields by any means. And at the moment, those playing fields are just grass. If they were half developed into housing and half given public access, trees, ponds, made into proper green spaces, they would be an improvement for this community, probably. That may not be true for every site that is being proposed. We're not trying to comment on every site. In fact, we've decided we're not going to comment on sites because we don't have enough local knowledge. But we are calling for the council to basically split the green sites. If you have to develop a green site, then improve it from a climate perspective and make sure that the housing on it is energy efficient. And then at the moment, the local plan calls for 30% affordable housing in new developments. And that probably is about the level that the city needs of affordable housing. But what the plan doesn't say is anything about how much of that housing should be rental housing. And the truth is that most affordable housing is not rental housing, and it is not affordable because people who need affordable rental housing do not have the money to buy a house, however cheap that house may be, however cheap that flat may be. They can't afford to buy a house, full stop. So what this plan needs is to specify a requirement for affordable rental housing, not just affordable housing. And that's why we think that the call should be for more than 30% of affordable housing, because we want 80% of that 50% to be affordable rental housing. The council, in the strategic growth plan, which is about housing and economic development for the county as a whole, seems to basically be taking the approach that developers don't provide as much affordable housing as you want, and therefore you have to provide them with extra development land in order to get as much affordable housing as you want. We'll let them build over extra spaces and build extra houses in order to get the minimal amount of affordable housing we need. We don't think that's a good approach. We think the approach should be require higher levels of affordable housing. If they're going to knock you down, start from a higher level. So that's why we're calling for a higher level. Higher housing density. So at the moment, the local plan is calling for, in the central development area, so that's the city centre, but it sprawls out over quite a lot more than just the city centre, to be 50 dwellings per hectare, which is somewhere between terraced housing and semi-detached housing. And outside of that, for the whole of the rest of the city and the big developments that they're proposing around the edge of the city, they're calling for 30 dwelling per hectare, which is basically semi-detached housing. And we know that semi-detached housing is not affordable for low-income people. It requires you to have a car. It spreads over a lot of land, so you can't move around because it's too far to travel to the local services. You can't get to the services you need to get to, and it makes people car dependent. So it then becomes unusable for people to live in that area unless they have the money to own a car. And it means that the people who do live in those areas end up driving all over the place to everything. And Hamilton is a really, really good example of this kind of development. So what we're saying is that the council should be looking at 100 dwellings per hectare in the central development area. So that would mean, and in the outside, in the whole of the rest of the city, they should be looking at 70 dwellings per hectare. So I'm going to just jump down and show you what this means. In Highfields, the terraced housing, which does give people private gardens, albeit small ones, back private gardens, is 92 and 91 dwellings per hectare. In Clarendon Park, oh yeah, and that's true, in Clarendon Park, it's that kind of thing as well. So terraced housing with private outside space is well within what we are talking about. So when we talk about high density, we are not talking about high-rise flats. Please don't think that we are. We are not proposing that the council builds high-rise flats all over Leicester. We're proposing that they build terraced houses, which are a lot more energy efficient naturally, which bring people closer to their neighbours, and which mean that people are not car dependent, but does still give them private space as well as shared space. Whereas Evesham Road or Thurnby, these are the kinds of dwellings per hectare that you get in semi-detached housing: 20 dwellings per hectare, 30 dwellings per hectare, and for semi-detached, and 12 for detached, although I think that was particularly bad, that area. So Bed-Z in London is an example of a new development where they've mixed housing and business, so kind of commercial and housing. And it's got flats and it's got houses, and it's very, very energy efficiency, and it has an average of 100 dwellings per hectare. So if you look at this map, you can see a lot of different types of housing. This does not include that sports pitch. The calculation of the dwellings per hectare does not include the playing field. And Bed-Z in London is a really popular place to live. It's like, it has continued to be a really popular place to live. It's 3 stories instead of the typical 2 stories. It gives people a mixture of private space and outside space. So that's an example. Goldsmith in London, Goldsmith Street in Norwich in Norfolk is 83 dwellings per hectare. It gives people very small outside backyards, which is private, and that's what you would see behind these fenced areas. This was only built last year, which is why it's still only got tiny trees and it looks so very new and weird. As it mellows, it will become more attractive, I imagine. But as you can see, it also has shared space, and it is built around encouraging people to walk and cycle and not to drive. So whilst there are car parking spaces towards the outside of the development, you can see they've been set as bays with trees, which minimises the cars, and it pushes the cars to the outside of the development so that the car stops being your first choice, because you have to walk for a minute to get to your car. Not a long way, but for a minute to get to your car, instead of jumping on your bike or walking more generally. This is Maida Vale in London. This is 200 to 350 dwellings per hectare, because these have been converted into flats, various sizes of flats. I don't think I've got a picture of Alta Area in Vienna, but Vienna has a huge building development. If you look at our website, you can see a picture of that. And they've done high-rise flats, but on the bottom 8 levels, they've basically staggered it so that each flat gets a private terrace garden on the roof of the flat below, on the level below. So people in those flats have private green space. So whilst we wouldn't be advocating for that kind of high-rise flats, that kind of staggering shows that even with flats, you can actually you can get higher housing density. So we're calling for higher housing density. And then where they do develop beyond the city, it should have similar levels of density to the city. It shouldn't just be sprawled out, making it car dependent. And it shouldn't be in roads, like built along roads. It should be tied up against the city so that people can get to services. The reason people live in a city is because they want the things that that city provides, or because they can't afford to live in the countryside. The current idea of what's being proposed in this plan, with only 30 dwellings per hectare beyond the city, doesn't give them access to the services, but it also doesn't make it affordable to the kind of people who might want to live in the countryside but can't afford to. So it's kind of worst of both worlds approach. This local plan has nothing in it about land allocation for food and water security. I would suggest that it ought to be allocating land for tree planting, food tree planting outside of the city. And it also ought to be allocating land for us to dig a new water reservoir. We are going to have wetter winters, which we want. Having a reservoir that absorbs floodwaters will be a plus. We are also going to have much drier summers. We are going to have droughts. Water is going to become an issue in the next 100 years. Why not dig a new reservoir? Why not allocate land for that in this local plan? The city is going to need water. They should be planning for security around this. There's nothing in the local plan about this. There is a freight policy. It says pretty much nothing. And we think that the local plan should include a proper freight policy. And specifically, the local plan currently develops the train station for business development, business offices, for office development. We're not to office development on the train station site, but the ground floor of it should be kept for developing a last mile freight hub, so that there's a main line, freight line that goes through Leicester. It already goes through the station. Freight trains could stop in the station. They could unload freight for Leicester and then they could continue. And that freight could then be delivered last mile delivery using electric vans, electric bikes, cargo bikes, things like that. The city needs to retain enough space next to the train station that as it develops its freight plan, which does not yet exist, it hasn't made it impossible for it to act on it because it's already built all over the land right by the train station. This is the moment for them to retain that land for a freight plan, not develop it. And like I say, they could build upwards. And I think they are planning to build upwards in that area. So they could push it a bit higher. There's already high rise in that area. So it wouldn't be as visually disturbing as it would be elsewhere. So they need a freight policy. And they need to put policies into this local plan which require developers to discourage car use in their developments. They are already putting in policies about encouraging walking and cycling, which is great, but they have almost nothing about bus use. I know now is not a popular moment to talk about bus use, but the reality is that there are a lot of people in this city. Over 30% of the households in the city do not own a car, cannot afford to own a car. That's almost a third of the people in this city. It's not reasonable to come up with a policy that prioritises car users, who are the people who generally have more resources, over people who have less money, do not own a car, and are dependent on our bus service to get to anywhere that they need to get to, be it work, be it friends, be it the doctors, be it the hospital, you name it. So we think that the council should be saying in this plan that they are going to apply for a bus franchise. The one brilliant, excellent thing in this plan is that they have actually mentioned, and they are going ahead with, putting in a workplace parking levy. which means that businesses will be paying for each of the parking spaces that they provide to their employees. And that money will then get put directly back into our public transport system. It is a way of raising money for our public transport system. It's really good. It is mentioned in the local plan, which is why we think that they should be saying in the local plan that they want to apply for a bus franchise. In fact, the council is not applying for a bus franchise. What it is doing, and what it says in the local plan, although not in a policy, what it says it's going to do is to build a bus partnership with the bus companies. Well, bus partnerships are not being found to work across the country. The council have the legal right to go to national government and say we want a bus franchise. What that means would be that they could define where the routes run, and they could tell the bus companies when they want to run, how much they want to charge. They could define the service and then open it up to tender from the bus companies. It gives the council the power to actually give us a functional bus network. They should be stating a commitment to applying for a bus franchise in this local plan. They're not doing that. And back to land allocation, obviously the local plan is primarily about land allocation. We need to be prioritising local renewable energy generation. As energy becomes more intermittent from the outside, we need to be more locally sustainable. If they are developing greenfield sites around the city, one of the things they should be doing is allocating land for solar and wind farms to generate energy for the city. And they should also be promoting renewable generation within the city. They should be promoting solar panels within the city. They should be encouraging people to put solar panels on their roofs within the city. We could put solar panels on so many of the roofs in this city. It would make so much difference to how much energy we could generate. It would reduce our carbon footprint, but it would also mean that we have energy to provide the services that are needed locally as energy becomes less sustainable outside, as climate chaos kicks in. So the other thing that land allocation is needed for, and this is the last point, our point 11, is that they should be allocating land beyond the city specifically for tree planting. And I know I mentioned this earlier, because trees absorb carbon and they increase biodiversity and they reduce the temperature surrounding the city. And if you plant food trees, they provide us with a local source of food. During the Second World War, places in Italy and Spain became very dependent on their chestnut trees as a source of starch. I have a friend who works in DEFRA. She says that they think in DEFRA that within the next 30 years, we will not be able to grow wheat in this country. We will not be able to grow potatoes in this country. We need a local source of starch. Why not have chestnut groves why not allocate land for food trees so that we can make sure that we at least begin to address this? And to be honest, this local plan should include other stuff around food as well. But in terms of land allocation, tree planting. So these are the main points that we basically think should be in the local plan. And it opens tomorrow. The consultation opens tomorrow. If you go to our website, which is at the bottom of this page, it's www.climateactionleicesterandleicestershire.org.uk. If you go to our website, you will find a 7-minute survey that you can do about the local plan. It will help you to start thinking about the issues, and we will send the survey results to the council as part of the climate action response to this consultation. So we want as many people to respond to that 7-minute survey as possible, but it will also get you starting to think about what you feel about the kinds of issues I've been talking about tonight. And there is also a link to a pledge. We are trying to get, obviously, if we want to get 400 responses, we basically need at least 100 people to pledge to respond themselves and to help 3 other people to do it. You know, we need, I think at the moment we've got about 60 people who have made a pledge to respond to the consultation. Please make a pledge and commit yourself to holding other people's hands and helping them do it too. It's not, if we're going to hit 400, we are going to need to actually physically help people do it. Ring up your friend who lives down the road and say, well, once we can meet in people's gardens, don't do it right now. Can I meet you in your garden and help you to literally write your response? Hold your hand while you do it. It doesn't need to be a complicated response. Yes, by all means, write a complicated response, but alternatively, just write one paragraph about why this matters to you, calling for detailed climate policy that actually addresses what we're talking about here. On that webpage, there is also a briefing covering what I have talked about tonight. A one-page briefing summarising the main 11 points that we think the council needs to include in the local plan. There is also a whole load of other stuff that will help you to do this, including the planning group has been working with Friends of the Earth to actually rewrite the council's policy. We have rewritten the policy in the local plan for housing, for development, for climate change, and for transport. We have rewritten those policies. The 30 pages of policy that we have written are on the website. It's there if you want it. These are the example policies, and we're already talking to the council about those policies and how we want them to use these policies. These are examples of policies that other councils are using, or they are rewrites that we feel are within the legal jurisdiction of our council to be able to do. And that is everything that I am going to say. So